Thank you, Carl, and thank you, John, for getting us excited about being here. Do you feel a little bit excited to be at this workshop after that introduction? Are you ready to work? Roll up your sleeves. So before I start, I hope to get to know everybody in this room in the next day or so. But I think it'd be fun to get a little bit of sense of who's here. So stand up if you're from a computer science department. Okay. Thank you, computer science colleagues in the room. Math department. Do you have any mathematicians in the room? Yay. Clap for our mathematician colleagues. Other methodological departments? Do we have any other sort of methods type departments or positions? Engineers? Any engineers in the room? Any engineering? All right. Okay. So we've covered a lot of people in the room. Who have we missed? What other kinds of yeah. Business. Okay. Anybody else here in a business school or business department? Okay. Stand up so everybody can see their business colleagues. Yes. Thank you. Yes. Hi. Biology. Any other biologists in the room? Stand up and okay. All right. Very enthusiastic biologists in the room. Thank you for joining us. Have we missed any others? Yeah. Hi. Industry. Do we have any people here from industry that have snuck into the room with the rest of us? Well, welcome. Okay. Anyone else want to declare themselves? Anyone else? Yeah. Yes. Hooray for the brave humanists that have come into our space and are going to tell us share their expertise with us. Hi. Misfit. Do you mean interdisciplinary? Okay. Wonderful. Okay. All right. It sounds like a good mix to me. Okay. So thank you. I don't know if we have folks online. Is somebody monitoring the online space for us? Yeah. Do we have any, you want to give a shout out to anybody that's online, where they're coming from or what departments or positions? I don't know.
We do have one economics professor online. Welcome, Patricia.
Okay, well, thanks. That helps a little bit, right? To know who's here with us. Okay, so I'm just going to try to, what I was going to try to do to get us set up is just a little bit of trying to map out how we're thinking about data for good. And I know we're all coming from really different disciplines and different schools and have different backgrounds. So forgive me if I don't quite have the right framework, but I wanted to just try to get us started somehow so we can start connecting with people that are our peers and connecting with people that are complementary to what we have to offer to each other. So I'm going to just talk briefly about a couple of ways of thinking about our own data for good journey, and then a little bit about mapping a learner's journey onto the data for good workflow, and then weaving good through the learning experiences that we facilitate. So more or less trying to help us figure out how to get on the same page with each other the rest of this time. As Carl mentioned, I'm coming at this more from a project perspective, as more so for the Data Science for Social Good program at University of Washington, it's been going since 2015. There's been 27 projects. I think there's about something less than we're at now 29 projects because we're about to start if we count this summer. So there's something like 200 people, like 20 different project leads that are coming from, they're looking at anti-poverty measures and public administrative data. They're looking at climate mitigation. They're geospatial, all kinds of different problem spaces. So it's been a really fun and interesting thing to be immersed in those projects and helping them to think about the good that those projects do. And I also happen to be in a computing and software systems department, and my degrees are in engineering. So with that in mind, I just want to say I'm going to mostly try to map us all out so we can have a conversation together, but I am taking a little bit of editorial license to throw in some of my own observational notes here and there, which my observations and perspectives, they may not apply to your situation, so you're welcome to take them or leave them. Okay, so mapping your data for good journey. I pulled together 10 considerations that might get us started. And I'm just going to quickly go through these so that we, again, can have a conversation with each other. And the first one is, what kind of good are you aiming to do, right? Some forms of good are certainly more straightforward than others, right? There's the good news is that data for good problems span all of these categories or ranges, or there's a lot of work out there for us, whatever our situation is, right? We can think about the good we're trying to do in terms of degree of impact, right? So there might be intended and unintended consequences. There might be direct and indirect impacts. Those are some of the things that we might have to be considering as we're thinking about data for good. There's also novelty, right? So novelty can apply to application or the intervention. Novelty can apply to the research question or technological or methodological things that we're trying to do, right? Those can be low or high. And I would just, an observer note about it, that is that as academics who want to do good with data and teach others to do so, we might actually sometimes feel pressure from different groups regarding the degree of novelty that we want, right? So a lot of times, if we're working with, an implementation with an organization, they might not be excited about a novel method, right? But certainly NSF is, right? So we are often in this conundrum of trying to make decisions around how much novelty we want to bring into these projects. And it's helpful to sort of map that for ourselves. And of course, there's also the complexity of the problem, and complexity comes at us in data for good from a lot of different directions, right? So we have this technological or methodological complexity. We have organizational complexity. We have social complexity, right? And so these can be, again, lower or higher, right? So technological or methodological complexity, some of us are teaching things like Tableau dashboard, right? Which maybe could be learned in a few days or maybe even a single lesson. We might be able to help some people with well understood data to start getting insights, right? So that's kind of a simpler situation. But then, we also have, many of us are trying to come up with novel methods and ways of problem solving things. There's also the sensitivity that's involved in the, in the data, things like that, scale. These all add more complexity to the problem. It's a lot harder to do something with data if we also have to protect the privacy of the people involved, for example, right? And those kind of trade-offs, which often come into play for data for good. Of course, organizational complexity, always easier when there's one decision maker, you, the teacher in the classroom, right? Or you defer to your students. Much harder if we're doing something like we're working with multiple organizations, we're working with less resource organizations. And then, of course, social complexity, right? So sort of on the easier side, maybe of the street, I said lower complexity, not no complexity. If we're addressing a problem that has high social agreement and a shared understanding of the problem, then we're, it's going to be a little bit maybe less circuitous route, an easier, more straightforward path than when we're dealing with an issue that has low social agreement or controversy, where those impacted are not the decision makers, are not shaping the project, which is often the case in a lot of data science projects, right? When there's concerns, when the concern that we're working on involves vulnerable people, less resourced people, or historically marginalized groups, there's maybe more that has to come into consideration, right? So a couple of observer notes I'm just throwing in here around this. My own thought about this is that if we're thinking about things like coursework, I think that monitoring and evaluation and other established and repeatable but Valuable analysis are probably likely easier to fold into coursework than novel data and research questions. So I think that that's something that there's both a high demand among a lot of organizations need that kind of support. You can probably find plenty around your school or your university, or even within your university that need that kind of support. But I think it also aligns well with the need that we have to manage our course preps and things like that with the learners' needs around being able to scaffold integrative learning around this this topic, around a good topic, as well as the need for organizations that are less resourced to have a repeatable source of data analytics, right? So that's one I think is kind of a great place to be looking possibly for scaffolding data for good work, especially those of us that are more teaching methodological types of subjects, which I think a lot of us are in this room. Okay, what's new to you, right? So anything that has anything to do with a project, what's new, add some challenges for us, right? So the skills and knowledge resources that you have on hand versus those that are more in development or more on your own learning curve. Of course, we need to be thinking about buffering in time for our own learning curves and also for building new relationships, right? So having there new times too. Like if it's new to you, then you probably want to give yourself more time, right? If a lot of these things on this list are new, then even more time, right? So research question, methods, data, subject matter, collaborations, the intervention space, which is a lot of things, the stakeholders that you're working with, the sponsors that you're working with. If it's newer, yeah, it might take more setup. It might take more going. There might be surprises along the road, right? What is your theory of change? So is that familiar language to people? Theory of change? So this is coming more from, again, more from the social good side. This is something that you'll hear a lot in social change organizations or, government organizations, humanitarian sector. They have a theory of change. And that means that they're thinking about, and we need to be thinking about this when we're setting these projects up. How is the data that we're working with in some manner leading to a particular social good? Right? So that whatever that logic, train of logics is, that's our theory of change. And it's really important to understand who shares our theory of change, whose versions of good we're thinking about. We need to be able to explain that if we want to attract resources, if we want to attract collaborators, and of course, if we want to get buy-in and explain it to our students, then that becomes important for us to understand. The observer note here is that, of course, it's always better when you have a clear and specific theory of change, right? The more effective we're going to be. And that's certainly why there's pressure in social change organizations, NGOs, government organizations for theory of change to be explicit. The reality is, though, we gain experience. As we gain experience, we gain clarity, right? So just be aware that when we're approaching a new problem space or intervention space, new collaborators, right, these things take experience and time to build up. So we need to pace ourselves and be aware that our theory of change might start off pretty vague, might have some bumps in the road in terms of our logic and the assumptions we're moving, but as we go forward, we get better at this. What is your personal contribution to the good you're aiming to achieve? So I learned this language from Heather Leeson of the Solferino Academy of the International Red Cross. Solferino Academy convenes technologists and people working around data across the whole Red Cross, Red Crescent network. And she was talking to me about this thing that they're trying to encourage, which is falling in love with the problem, right? So innovation, good innovation that actually helps people in the humanitarian sector and other complex spaces. They're looking, the humanitarians are looking for people who are willing to fall in love with the problem. So one question to ask yourself is, what part of the problem are you in love with, right? Are you the methodological and technological questions, the subject matter knowledge, intervention know-how, and implementation know-how? Are you in love with the impacted communities? Okay. So, and when we have all those pieces come together, and we have a whole network, you might not be in love with every part of those. You might not be that person, but across a data for good, if we're going to implement data for good, then we want to have allies and partners who do represent, that are in love with all those pieces of the problem. So what is your relationship with those concerned, right? So understanding who trusts you and why they trust you, who you're accountable to and who is accountable to you. And whether you're aiming for a long-term relationship with this project and this data for good and the people involved, or a short-term relationship, right? It's probably good to be transparent about those things. I think that short-term work can provide a lot of value if you're working with someone who does own the problem and is in love with the problem. This is kind of somewhat random in the weeds for a high level perspective, but one thing that I think is really, really impactful in the data science for social good program at UW is that we always do a stakeholder analysis. Every project does a stakeholder analysis. So this is an example of taking things that are used in for good spaces to help understand change and what's going to really be impactful, taking in those practices and blending those together intentionally with our methodological and technological methods as well. Then when we blend these kind of things, they can be very impactful. A stakeholder analysis workshop we do it in 2 hours, and it always makes a difference for the teams. How much time do you need? So, we're up against the fact that good science is slow and incremental and the work of many hands, and good social change is also slow and incremental and the work of many, many, many hands, right? And yet there's pressures for us to be results oriented, especially in methodological fields. In computer science, we didn't even believe in journals until very recently, right? It was like, you got to, like journals take forever to publish. You got to have something out every year, right? And so that's a little bit in competition with how a lot of good happens in the world. And that trickles down to our students, and that trickles out into how industry thinks about innovation and change. So there's some reconciliation of that needs to happen a lot of times on these projects. And there's also the human dimension, is that some problems might take decades, but something like predictive analytics for a socially sensitive topic, my read on that is that might take decades actually to get social and scientific consensus on a lot of those things. But the human dimension here is that we need to feel like we're making authentic contributions to stay motivated, and so do our students. So those things are, can be challenging to sort of reconcile with as we're doing this work. My own observer note on that is giving students the opportunity to connect directly with people who are the direct beneficiaries of the work that we're doing, and as well as the stewards of the social good. And by stewards, I mean the people that are in the implementation spaces, that are in those organizations that are doing this work, that are going to actually take our analyses and do something with them and make decisions around them. Those are very motivating experiences for the students. They see their own work in perspective. It helps them to develop and sustain motivation, and it improves the quality of their work. So something like, one thing I can say definitively now, having worked with people across all the sciences at eScience, from, PhDs, project leads across multiple fields, very few of us like documentation. Very few of us want to sit down and stop analysis and start writing something up, right? But boy, when you take somebody who has been doing some analysis, and then you sit them down with a community organization, and now they see somebody who says, I would love to try this method out. I think this could really help us. I'd like to do this analysis, but I need some documentation. I need some examples I can work through. Now it's really motivating to those students. Now they want to, now they know that their work is going to make a difference, and they can see that happening. I encourage that. I know it's challenging, especially in courses, to do that, but whenever we can do it, it can work out really well. Okay, how much time do you have? Well, Just a high level observer note here. I think there's marathon runners, right? The people that own the problem and love the problem, who are often subject matter experts. They're often the interventionists and the implementers that are out in the field doing the work, those stewards of social goods. And also those who are establishing and maintaining trusted relationships with the impacted community. And that's one of the hardest things for people that are coming from a data science perspective. And that's really one of the most, one of our kind of like, a lot of us, that is where maybe we're the most distant from doing good. But I'm not to say that there's not people out there doing it, because there's a lot of people out there doing it. But just as a field, I think it's really challenging to blend those things together. But certainly, if we step back and think about, okay, where does good happen and how is it affected? Like, how does it actually occur? Then we know that that's part of the mix. Now, methodological experts like us, we and those of us with complementary experience and subject matter expertise, we can come in and support sprints, right? We're sort of a little bit better at sort of weaving into those who love are in love with the problem, right? So at UW DSSG, we have teams of professional data scientists and advanced students with computational and statistical skills. They're working for 10 weeks. But they're working alongside with a subject matter expert who is a project lead. So that subject matter expert with a project lead, and I should say, who has a theory of change that we all believe is kind of viable and has those relationships, or is willing, credibly willing to build the relationships with the people in the field that want to do the implementation. That's how we manage in 10 weeks to put these things together. Who are your learners? Okay, so we probably have lots of different kinds of learners that we're committed to. We're at different institutions, and there's higher ed is a much broader. Hopefully, we're serving a really broad swath of different kinds of students, right? So of course, I just want to note, this is, again, just part of the mapping exercise. Where are each of us on our journey, and where are we trying to get to? But there's some differences, right, between coaching PhD students to tackle novel scientific discoveries, or introducing basic analytics to first-year undergraduates. And Data for Good can apply in either place, right? And so I just want to note here that that one observer note is one of the things that really compels me to this work and this space is that I think that Data for Good, one of the strongest rationales for bringing this into curriculums or bringing it into classrooms or selling it to a lot of us that are in the more methodological fields, if you have to sell this kind of work to your colleagues, there is a lot of science that it was not done by me and is not my science, but I looked it up through the national academies. They have lit reviews on this stuff, and that are pretty compelling. The science that expresses communitarian values aids in the retention of women and other minoritized groups in STEM. And so it's more collaborative science. It's a different way of doing science. It creates different kinds of learning opportunities for different kinds of learners. And I might have added as well, this is also more how public sector works. This is also more how your local government works, right, or should. So it's also preparing people for different kinds of work out in the world. How does the good that you're aiming for relate to the subject areas that you teach? So yes, I don't teach parallel processing. I guess as we were talking at lunch about different, I've got to teach this, I got to do that. But even here, even though my work and what I teach is more on the design side, I'm teaching engineers design and ethics and user research, but I feel this pressure too, right? I feel the pressure of having a specific curriculum that I have to deliver to prepare people for jobs, right? To prepare them for the tech industry. A lot of what we do in social and thinking about Data for Good, it may be less directly applicable to get to what somebody needs to say in a job interview. And that creates a tension sometimes. So, I mean, and just in terms of the mapping exercise, some of us here, we have at least one person here, right, who's coming from this other side of maybe you're here to sort of bring in the data or computational techniques or things into a subject matter expertise, right? And some of us are trying to do the opposite. We're trying to bring subject matter into computational statistical classes. We're trying to, bring in real world contextual problems into those spaces. So those are different journeys for us as educators, and they put us into different kind of predicaments that hopefully we'll get some chance to work out together in a little bit. I just want to say, because I am talking mostly to methodological folks coming from a methodological discipline myself, that a word of caution about method, for methods-oriented and educators, I think it's really tricky. We are very solution-oriented, and we train people to be very solution-oriented. And that can be like, in again, the humanitarian space is one that I've done some work in, and they don't always appreciate the solutions that we come running to them with. It can be tricky if you're starting there, right? A lot of times social good and social change, it's more about relationship building first, and then co-understanding the problem together and getting on the same page before we were ready to talk solutions. I have an example. I've heard this a couple of times, so it's going to anonymize it, but from somebody that is in the network of this kind of space that we're in and does this kind of work, about they had this sponsor that was willing to give them a lot of money for a Data for Good program. The catch was they wanted it to be career oriented. They were looking for, it was an industry player that wanted to get people that had a certain methodological skill set into their workforce. And so they thought, wow, we can do double duty. We'll fund this Data for Good program. We'll have these students using these techniques, and then we'll hire them. And the problem was that the Data for Good program was trying to do community-based work. And the community had different issues and didn't need those methods. So it put people in this kind of bind. We sort of want to avoid those kind of situations if we can, and head them off. Okay, so what support can you marshal? So resources, collaborations, how do you create these alignments? Whose expectations do you need to align? Community-based work, can have a lot of impact. It can be really rewarding for you. It can be rewarding for your students. But it's not always valued in our job descriptions. It's not always what our tenure committees are looking at for those of us that are on tenure. So ideally, I think what we're looking for here to be able to resource this work and both in amongst ourselves to be able to train people and teach people this, but also prepare them for the real world, much Data for Good work that needs to happen out in the world. We want to be resourcing all the work that's involved, right? So that relationship building component, and that might require educating your stakeholders, right? So the people that influence whether you have a job next year, your project sponsors, your donors. This might require some education and advocacy for this kind of work in some cases. One example that I have is that somebody I know that they were able to get a Data for Good project as part of their tenure package, so they negotiated for that. So you can start thinking about that, these kind of ways that we might be able to better resource ourselves to better prepare our students. Okay, mapping your learner's journey to the Data for Good workflow. This is the diagram that about selecting projects. So I'll share the link to the white paper that this is in a little bit, in a moment. But Anissa Tanweer and Sarah Stone and I, who are all at the eScience Institute, we spent a lot of time trying to make a workflow, but we didn't want to be too prescriptive about it, because the reality is that Data for Good workflows look different depending on the project and the expertise that's involved, and who and what you're trying to discover, right? So we wanted something here that sort of covered the bases from articulating research questions, identifying data, data cleaning and prep, data infrastructure and pipeline, analysis and modeling, but we didn't want to be too prescriptive, because we know that these take a little bit of a different turn depending on your particular work. And nevertheless, the good news is that across the whole spectrum, of whatever it takes, right through to implementation, integration, partner communication, all these things. Really, any part of this can be a data for good project, right? And so we have lots of examples across different university based teachers and mentors for all kinds of projects that have worked out well. So one of my favorites is the University of Iowa. Data for the common good, I think, is it data for the public good? Iowa State University. I'm sorry, it's Iowa State University. They're connected with the extension. And so they're very oriented towards helping the small governments, the rural governments, and small organizations around Iowa to better make use of their data. And so they spend a lot of time focusing on articulating research questions and identifying data. They call it data discovery, which is a really useful thing for them, right? So on the other side of the coin, public communication, software publication, we've had at eScience, we've had a couple of projects where, people basically take what sometimes is called gradware, which is this kind of messy stuff that lets you do analysis and writes papers and maybe even change public policy or, do really innovative things, but is not of a quality that it could really be reproducible or shared by other by other researchers. And so that's its own thing. Just getting something from, getting software out of the ugly stage into something that you're proud is on GitHub could be can be a really good data for good project. Of course, when we think about data science, what everyone thinks about is analysis, modeling, interpretation, integration, right? That's where we are often thinking about these kind of projects. And I just want to say that when we're thinking about setting those up for students, if the goal is to have the students spend most of their time modeling and doing analysis with results that can be shared at the end, then there's a lot of preparation that has to happen before those students get involved, right? You need the research question, the research plan, the intervention plan. You need ready to use data when you're collaborating. Sometimes with, something like a small government organization, sometimes they don't know. They might not even know if you have who owns the data or if they have access to it, right? You might be dealing with that kind of situation. It might need to require a lot of prep. Most of us don't like prepping data, even though we all know it needs to happen. So, that might be to give students a great experience and get them excited. You might be hiding some of that. You might be cleaning some of that up in advance. And then, of course, after the students are done with analysis and modeling, there's the whole integration of deliverables into the intervention. And that's a whole other step. So even thinking about how to get whatever students do into a shape that somebody can actually use, there's a lot of effort behind the scenes there. Okay, so last portion. How am I doing on time? Oh yeah, okay, we're good. All right, so weaving good through the learning experiences that we facilitate. So again, this is part of a sort of the mapping where we are, what do we want to talk about, how do we want to spend our time together, right? There's a lot of opportunities for data for good, I think, across every level of teaching and learning, where we're thinking about sectors. So like, what can we as educators, as people in higher education, think about partnering with government or partnering with community-based organizations? What can we do within our educational institutions, right? So Georgetown, I think, is inspiring their master's in data science for public policy. So that's a collaboration between computer science and the public policy school. So people are coming out with that policy focus, knowing what's going to be helpful in terms of data science and building up that particular kind of good. And then, of course, program department offerings. I think it's interesting to think about either projects or concepts that could be woven through multiple courses. And then, of course, we can always focus course offerings, research for credit, internships, non-credit summer programs, workshops, hackathons, lesson plans, right? Down to the lesson plan. We can think about these things together if we want to, if that's how you want to spend your time. And I'm going to, this is my last observer note. I want to say that I think it's really imperative that we think about this as integrative learning. And it doesn't mean that we have to hold up every single aspect of the work, but it is something that eventually if we want to affect good with data, it is this is integrative learning that we're doing, right? And facilitating one way or another, even if we have a whole team of collaborators that need to be involved to make that happen. And this is more of this. So I'm now touching on the things that are more in my research area here, right? So hanging out with these projects is also to just really for me to help me learn about how data for good happens, both not just for learners, but also in the real world, in real science and real context, right? And so what we're learning at the Data Science for Social Good program, which aligns with much other research that has happened elsewhere and over a good amount of time, is that social and technical and social considerations are entwined in every phase of these projects, right? So from articulating the research question, identifying data, but even these mundane things like cleaning the data or developing a data infrastructure and pipeline. Like you're sitting there and you're thinking about, once you start bringing in the good and you start thinking about, okay, who's going to be using this pipeline? Who's going to be using this analysis? Suddenly there's all kinds of decisions that have consequences for depending on how you conceive of who the beneficiaries are, who's going to be using this analysis and so on. And I actually have a little summary here. I'm not going to read all this because I'm going to share it. I'm going to put it in the resources folder. I haven't yet, but I promise I will. But basically it's examples of all of these different examples of the very mundane and ordinary way that the social, technical, and ethical considerations are really entwined and weaved together. Even in 10 weeks of what is definitely all about modeling and analysis, and is as deep in the weeds technically as you can possibly get with people that are trying to do novel, cutting-edge data science on some problem. We just can't escape the entwinement of these social and technical considerations and the ethical considerations. And so, that has consequences, not only for how we teach, but really for what we want our students to be able to understand about this space and how we prepare them for this kind of work in the world. So on day 2, the second day, always the second day of UW DSSG is spent on a workshop that's led by Anissa Tanweer. I think the UW DSSG is the only data science for social good program that is, the chair is an ethnographer, which gives a really different flavor. Introduction to data science for social good. And this is a slide. We start off right away telling the students, social and actually the teams, the project leads and the data scientists as well, social and ethical challenges are baked into data science. If some of us are really well prepared for that. In engineering and other fields, we do a really uneven job about preparing people for making those decisions on the fly as they're doing the work. And we know better. So this is Dorsey Cross coevolution of the problem solution. This is one of the most cited works in design studies. It applies across the field. It's something that's been found in architecture, in computer science. The earliest coevolution of the problem solution papers are actually about early AI. Okay, not what AI does, but how you get AI made. It goes with this. And so what I'm saying is, yes, we know that technology is designed this way. We know that you have to be figuring out that you're actually, it's more like you're problem solving on the fly, hopefully in a strategic way, but it's still problem solving, one step at a time. And the ethical and social elements are actually part of that problem solving all the way through. So that leads me to this question that I hold really close to my heart, which is, what can we do to more intentionally weave together this integrative learning that we need to prepare students for what it actually takes to do good with data across all the learning experiences that we facilitate. And this is, I think, some good news. My observer note is that I see a lot of inspiration. I take a lot of inspiration for what I see at liberal arts colleges So that this problem that you have of only having 3 or 4 people to teach 3 or 4 courses in computer science or stats or what have you, now becomes an opportunity, right, in the data for good space, because you have these collaborators across campus that can provide that subject matter knowledge, that context, that humanist perspective, right? The philosophers that really understand how to break down, hairy categories into something that makes sense to human beings. So I have a couple of examples here. Francesca Mason from Mount Mary University. They have a program that they just started in UX design, a very hot technological career students want to get into. But it has a very different flavor at a school that has 100 years of social justice commitment. In that context, it's a very different program, and it's really cool, and I'm really excited about it. Another example, Wendy Norris at Nazareth College, which is in Syracuse. It's a tiny college in Syracuse, practical AI and machine learning. Nazareth College, requires, as many small colleges do, students to work with do community organization work and service work as part of their, she brings that requirement into and has integrated into her practical AI and machine learning class, where basically coaching them to be consulting data analysts with the local organization. And I just want to say, I also want to hit that I know I've just thrown a lot of stuff at you, right? And I want to say that my last point here on this is that whether we're doing a heavy emphasis or a light emphasis on doing good, I think even a light touch can be really valuable. So one of the things that if you buy my story, that ethical and social considerations are really deeply baked into how we problem solve around data for good. And even in these stats classes, technology, computing courses, I think that what would happen if we were asking, every week, we just had a focusing question that asked people about the ethical considerations, every week. Some people are already doing that. Did I hear that? Yeah. Okay. Awesome. I want to talk to you, right? But if we were all doing that, what kind of a culture shift would there be? Because what I know from DSSG is that a lot of us are afraid we get these technical skills, and then we're afraid to have those conversations. And how can we go out in the industry or in government or other spaces if it doesn't feel totally normal to say, I've got this weird thing in my gut. I don't feel right about this. No, this doesn't make sense to me. Is this really going to support the impacted community? So I really like that idea, of small ways, small changes, these little light changes that we might be able to make that could normalize ethical reasoning and integrative learning. Okay, I'm not going to show you anything. I just wanted to plug that I am going to put some resources into the data to our shared resource folder. The Data for Good growth map is mostly about the summer programs like UOW DSSG, but might help you out if you want to look at it. And I'll also put in the human-centered design curriculum that we have for DSSG, as well as our overall map of program activities. And with that, mapping your data for good journey. I'd love to learn about your journey. I hope that we will get a lot of time to unpack that. The good news is I think people in your situation are innovating. We're all innovating in this space. We're helping to create a new space, as Carl said. So I'm hoping that you find some of your peers here or deepen your relationship, as well as some people who can complement what you do. Mapping the journey for our learners. The good news is any part of the journey is worthy of teaching and learning. Any part you want to take on. Probably don't want to take it on all in one quarter or one semester, but whatever you take on is a valid choice. And then we have some time to look at these different ways that we can bring this work into different aspects of our responsibilities as teachers and mentors and stewards of higher education. So the good news is we're going to spend the rest of the weekend exchanging ideas on how to do that. So thank you for your time. And thank you. I want to acknowledge that the West Big Data Innovation Hub was the sponsor of some of this work. So thank you very much.